Never underestimate, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Now that's a quote from the US activist Margaret Mead, and I have that quote on my wall, and I walk past it every day, and I guess I like it for two reasons. The first is just the beautiful simplicity of it, right? People power, power of just doing stuff. And I guess the second reason is because when you sometimes feel that governments are unable, or perhaps more importantly, unwilling to address many of the problems that we face in the world, it gives us hope that people power can and will fill that void. So what I'd like you all to do for a moment is just think about an issue that you care deeply about, right? And then imagine yourself coming together with a group of like-minded people to try and do something about that issue. So maybe you guys over here, you want to do something about the rights of workers building the infrastructure for the World Cup. I hear you have a few problems with that. And maybe you guys over here, you want to do something about child poverty, okay? And then you guys over here, you want to do something about corruption, okay? Here, that's another problem over here. And then you guys, maybe you guys want to do something about the environment. Maybe you want to clean up the river, the funky-looking river that flows through this town, okay? So, you've come together, you've got a cause, you've formed an association, maybe you've raised a little bit of money, and now you're going to start changing the world, right? It's not going to be easy, one step at a time, but that's what you're going to do. Okay, now, imagine that out of the blue, your government comes along and says, right, all of you guys in this room, you NGO types, the non-profit types, the do-gooders, we're worried that you guys pose a terrorism threat. We're worried that you guys are going to get involved with terrorism. So what we're going to do is pass a new law. And this law means that to carry on doing those activities that you're doing, you need to apply to the government for a license, okay? Carry on your activities without that license, and you're going to get a fine, or maybe you're going to go to jail. Okay, not only that, you now have to appoint someone in your organization, doesn't matter that you're only a titchy organization, whose job it is to report to the government every year on all of the things you've done, your activities, your projects, how much money you spent, where it came from. And you guys say, right, look, this is crazy. Yeah? We have nothing to do with terrorism, right? We're NGOs. Do you know what? There isn't even a terrorism problem here in Brazil, okay? And the government says, so fine. You've got nothing to fear. Don't worry about it. And the law is passed. Okay? Now let's skip forward, say 5 years, right? And some of you have had great success, right? Your anti-corruption organization over here, you guys are doing really well, okay? You're exposing corruption, you're challenging the government. But in doing so, you've also made some very powerful enemies. And by chance, it's time for you to renew your permit, your license to be an NGO. And the government says, well, guess what? Sorry, we're not going to renew it, okay? You're out of business. Your organization is effectively illegal. Now, it will have probably dawned on you by now that these are not some imaginary scenarios, right? These kinds of things are happening all over the world with increasing frequency. More than 50 countries in the world have passed repressive civil society laws. So why is this happening? Well, when you try to ask this question, what you find is that two ideas really dominate the thinking here. And the first says, well, look, you know, we've got repressive and less democratic governments, and they've always treated people power as a kind of, you know, a threat, an enemy within. And they've always reacted with repression and all this bureaucratic stuff, right? This is just the latest tool in their armory, okay? But then you say, well, yeah, of course, that's true up to a point. But this is also happening in democratic countries, right? This is happening in places like India. and the USA. And then you say, well, there's a kind of second narrative here, a second idea about why all of this is happening, and that is that after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, governments all over the world passed new counter-terrorism laws, and it was inevitable that civil society was going to get, caught up in this. It's collateral damage, as they call it. And you say, well, of course, yes, that's also true up to a point. But this is also happening in places that are entirely unconnected to the US-led war on terror. Places like Macedonia and the British Virgin Islands, and maybe it's even coming to you guys here in Brazil. And what I've discovered is there's actually a third phenomenon at work here. An international system of surveillance and control that is rewarding governments for adopting precisely these kinds of laws. And I've spent the last few years just trying to sort of expose and explain and challenge this system. Okay, so the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, as my North American friends call it. This is the most powerful intergovernmental institution that you've never heard of, right? FATF was created in the early 1990s with a mandate to prevent the global financial system from being used by money launderers and organized criminals and corrupt government officials to hide the proceeds of crime. And now, pretty much all countries in the world are committed to implementing FATF's recommendations on money laundering. Then 9/11 happens, and after this, well, FATF says, okay, now we're going to use this system of surveillance and control that we've created to go after the terrorist money, right? And this is where you guys come into the picture, you do-gooder NGO types, because one of the recommendations that FATF then adopts says, well, NGOs are particularly vulnerable to abuse by terrorist organizations. So what we need states to do is to review their laws to make sure that NGOs, you folks, can't indeed fall victim to such abuse. But they don't just make that recommendation. You might say, look, fair enough, international terrorism, we've got a problem here, this is sensible. Behind that recommendation, what they also say is, what you must do to fulfill these obligations is make sure that all of your NGOs are licensed or accredited, to make sure that they're under a legal obligation to tell the government exactly what it is that they're up to make sure that the whole non-profit sector is properly supervised by the police. Now, this really is a recipe for the kind of overbroad civil society legislation that I was talking about at the beginning. And what it does, really, is give governments a green light to adopt these kinds of laws in the name of counterterrorism and their international obligations. And of course, as we've seen here in Brazil in the run-up to the World Cup, this kind of legislation can all too easily be used to stifle dissent or to suppress social movements that are unpopular with governments. Okay, now FATF, it doesn't just make recommendations, right? What it does is every 7 years, it visits every single country and does an assessment of how well they're implementing each of the recommendations. And what we found when we started to look at this system was that the countries with the most repressive laws were getting the highest grades, right? It's like a test where your worst students, okay, get top marks, right? So when the FATF evaluators visited Mubarak's Egypt and Ben Ali's Tunisia, they said, top marks, okay? You're fully compliant with our obligations, right? Same story when they went to Saudi Arabia. They said, wow, and I quote, what we have here is a system that outclasses many other jurisdictions. What they didn't say was that to be an NGO in Saudi Arabia, you need permission from the king. They went to Uzbekistan, and they said, wow, another really comprehensive system of regulation. What they didn't say was that in Uzbekistan, all the international NGOs have been kicked out, and half of the domestic ones shut down. And of course, these grades matter a great deal to poorer and developing countries, because the grades that FATF awards are seen as an indicator of whether that country is a safe place for aid, trade, and investment. So what you have is this system that's rewarding states for adopting repressive laws. We looked at the evaluation reports of 159 different countries, right? Went through all of them. Most painful, horrible piece of research I've ever done. And what we found was that 90%, 89% of the grades awarded to countries were either non-compliant or only partially compliant. So what this means is that over the coming years, all of these countries, which includes Brazil, by the way, non-compliant, will come under significant pressure to adopt these kinds of civil society regulations. And indeed, since we did this research in 2012, we've seen these laws spreading around the world, and they tend to share two features. The first, as I mentioned before, is a demand that all non-profit organizations must be licensed and registered. In many countries, it is now easier to set up a business than it is to set up an NGO. You want to go make some money? Good luck. You want to try and make a difference? It's going to be tricky, right? In Pakistan, they've just proposed a new law that's going to make it much easier for the government to close down registered NGOs that the government deems as anti-state or anti-development, right? So in Pakistan, the intelligence services, they couldn't find Osama bin Laden, but they have the names and addresses of every single NGO in the country. The second feature of these laws is that they often impose wholesale restrictions on the amount of foreign funding that NGOs are entitled to receive, legally allowed to receive. And this is often justified because countries say, well, we don't want, foreign powers meddling in our affairs and, fomenting unrest. And I'm not going to say that this doesn't happen, but what does happen far more frequently is it means that human rights organizations, maybe you guys over here doing the anti-corruption work, who are dependent on foreign funding to do this, you're unable to get this funding, right? So unless you can find a domestic source, you're out of business. This is precisely what happened in India after it got a bad rating from FATF. The government passed a new law that said it's now going to be much easier for us to take away the permits of organizations who receive foreign funding. And as soon as this new law entered into force, what they did was just cancel the accreditation of 4,000 organizations. 700 of these organizations had allegedly been involved in protests, massive protests in southern India against a huge new nuclear power station. And then what we see from the WikiLeaks cables is that counterterrorism officials thought, oh, India, this is a wonderful law. This is a model law. Maybe we could use this as the basis for a new FATF compliance across the region. Same story in Ethiopia. The government there has just passed a law that says NGOs can only receive 5% of their budget from foreign sources. Now, the Ethiopian government gets 90% of its budget from the international community, but NGOs can only get 5%. The international community can fund state power, but it can't fund people power. So over the last couple of years, we've gathered together all of this evidence about how this system is encouraging the spread of repressive laws around the world. What we haven't found is much in the way of evidence that says, well, NGOs, you guys, are any more likely to get involved in terrorism than, say, any other sector of society. Of course, there are instances where the odd NGO is found to be implicated in terrorism, and these guys get punished under the ordinary criminal law. But you're talking about a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of a tiny percentage of the tens of millions of NGOs around the world, right? Yet, we have this top-down, one-size-fits-all system of international governance that is spreading these repressive regulations on the grounds that maybe NGOs are vulnerable to terrorism. All of this negative messaging around NGOs is also filtering through to the banks, right? The banks are also under FATF's jurisdiction, and they're under a legal obligation to ensure that their customers are not involved in money laundering, organized crime, or terrorism. And you may have heard about some of the billion-dollar fines that have been handed out to banks here in Latin America for failing to stop the money laundering by the drug cartels. And these obligations extend to NGOs who may also end up involved in illegal activities. And what's happened is this has made the banks extremely wary, particularly when it comes to NGOs who are operating in conflict zones or working with suspect communities. And these are the places, of course, that NGOs are arguably needed most, right? But what you find is that foundations and local organizations are finding it increasingly difficult just to access financial services. This is precisely what happened during the terrible floods in Pakistan in 2010. And it happened again during the awful famine in Somalia in 2011, right? People trying to deliver humanitarian aid were unable to complete their projects because of the financial restrictions that said, well, there's a danger that this kind of money, this money could end up in the hands of the Taliban or Al-Shabaab. Okay? So, not only is this tragic in the sense that literally projects collapse, local partners can't access the funds they need to do their work, it's also, in my mind, stupid, right? Because it's so counterproductive, because you get this void left by humanitarian organizations, right? Which is filled by the very same extremist organizations that the international community is trying to suppress. The problem is that it's a lot easier to ridicule and to criticize these kinds of international standards, rules, counterterrorism laws, than it is to change them, right? Civil society, we're often very good at standing up for other people's rights, but we're not so good at defending our own rights. Big organizations don't like to get involved in politics, and small ones, they don't want to speak out. They don't want to say we've got a problem with counterterrorism laws because of the negative publicity that this may attract. So what we've done, my colleagues and I at the Human Security Collective, at Statewatch, at the Transnational Institute, we've turned our small group of committed individuals into a much bigger group. We now have an international coalition of more than 80 foundations, international NGOs, civil society networks, grant-making organizations that's come together to demand change in the FATF standards and demand that the FATF respects international law protecting freedom of association and expression. We've started a dialogue with governments about these kind of problems, and we've been quite successful in the sense that the UK, the USA, Germany, the Netherlands, Japan, the World Bank actually issued a statement at FATF and said, guys, this was never our intention. We don't want to see this legal framework abused like this. For the first time, FATF has opened a dialogue with the non-profit sector to discuss the implications of these kinds of regulations. And I guess I'm just going to finish by saying this, right? You know, we've still got a mountain to climb, right? We've only begun to scratch the surface of this huge problem. But if we, this small group of civil society activists and scholars, with our research, just showing, look, hey guys, we've got a problem here. If we can start to penetrate these big, bureaucratic, unaccountable, faceless, entrenched organizations like FATF, then I hope that the rest of you can take some comfort in the fact that organized civil society can indeed make change. Thanks very much.